thought it'd be good to start by introducing the team. I'm Alison Littlejohn. I'm based here at UCL. I'm director of the UCL Knowledge Lab, which is a research centre focused on technology, learning, education, media, and so on. Louise Chisholm sends her apologies because she's in meetings all week this week. But just to say, so Louise is leading this project and she's the joint director of the UK SKA Regional Centre, and she is also based in UCL's Centre for Advanced Research Computing. Now I'm going to ask my other two colleagues if they want to introduce themselves, starting with Eileen Kennedy.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name's Eileen. I'm a professor in UCL Knowledge Lab along with Alison. My research has been around co-design for digital learning, largely sort of thinking about challenges that we can address through digital learning, online learning, usually at scale. I've been working in sort of various environments, like challenging environments, like conflict-affected areas, mass displacement, that kind of thing. And I bring that kind of interest in learning design, pedagogy for digital learning to the project.
And Francisco?
Hi everyone, my name is Francisco. I'm a research fellow in the Knowledge Lab. My research is on
I think it's their new form of
understanding the different form of.
So we got feedback on whether this is useful or not.
I don't know.
I think someone needs to mute. Yeah.
We need to mute it. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. I was saying that my research is on how scientific practices change over time and trying to understand the broader also context within science policy and practices and so on. So yes, that's it.
Okay, so if we move to the next slide, what we'd like to do is to give you a flavour of this Fair Data Accelerator Pilot project. We have been funded since October last year until March next year. And what we want to do is first of all, to tell you a little bit about the project, and secondly, to highlight some of the social challenges that we've found around data sharing. And then we want to end up by thinking about what an applied learning programme might look like for people who are working with digital research infrastructure. So in the next slide, I'm going to start off by just saying a little bit about the context of this project. So what we're aiming to do is to identify some of the unseen challenges of sharing data in a fair way. And what I mean by these unseen challenges, we'll give you some examples of what we've found from the project later. But basically what we're trying to do is to bring some concepts, theories and methodologies from social science more into how people work and how they learn with digital research infrastructure. And this can be a lot of different groups of roles. So it could be data specialists, it could be scientists in all different disciplines, it could be the people who are developing the platforms or the algorithms and so on. So we're aware that there's already been a lot of work in this area. So what we're trying to do is to add a new dimension, which is about the conceptualization of what it means to work and learn in new contexts. So the goals of this project have been to think about the social and cultural barriers to implementing fair principles and then work with communities to think about how we address these. So what we've been doing is, firstly, to identify what some of these social and cultural barriers are, to work with communities to think about how we build ways of professional development, but these professional development activities are very much linked to work to try to get around some of these cultural and social barriers. And then to think about how we scale this longer term. So more will be revealed in the presentation. In the next slide. This is our theory of change, just to give you a sort of diagrammatical explanation of what it is that we're trying to do. So step number 1, we've been using some social science methods to really explore what these unseen barriers and challenges will be. So by using social science methods, we try to identify barriers that are maybe not quite so visible. Maybe they're known, and there's almost a folklore about them, but we want to really understand the effects of them. And then secondly, as I said, we have run workshops to co-design activities that people can engage in to try to address some of these challenges within communities. The third thing is facilitating some of these co-designs within communities who are using digital research infrastructure, then evaluate and test their effectiveness and maybe change them. And then go round the loop again. So this is very much an iterative process. And what we're doing is building the tools and resources to build a program of activity which enables all of this, exploring barriers and then addressing these barriers. Longer term, what we want to do is to look at a wider range of different concepts and theories from social science, so that we can bring in other ways of understanding and addressing issues, and then use these with communities to try to find different ways to address some of these social problems and barriers. So things like behavioural change, for example, and other kinds of theories and methods. So that's the theory of change, and we'll revisit this during the presentation. So the next slide. This is really what we've been focusing on, is the inner circle of this theory of change. And what we'll do is we want to go through each of these steps, 1, 2, 3, and 4, from firstly using social science methods to explore and make visible these social and cultural barriers, to working with communities, to addressing them, testing them, and evaluating them. So I'm now going to hand over to Francisco, who's going to tell you a little bit more about how we explored these barriers.
Yes, thank you, Alison. Yes, I'm gonna just explain very briefly the first step, which is to explore the barriers, the social and cultural barriers to data sharing. So what we did, or what we propose to do, is to have some case studies, because we really think that it's important, the context where data sharing or data practices are enacted. So we have tried to have some case studies to explore those barriers, but also we propose to use a different set of methods to explore that, including, for example, this ethnography, different form of ethnographies like participant observation, but also mobile ethnography, where people working with data, for example, can send you some videos or some text. Focus group interviews and co-design. But for this pilot, what we did was just to interview a group of people from different digital research infrastructures, people leading or running those infrastructures. So you can see in this slide the different infrastructure and people we interview. So the point, the goal was trying to understand the social and cultural barriers that people really face at everyday level. So very quickly, we found different barriers, and we group them in two themes. The first one is this idea of epistemic uncertainties. So it's about fears, concerns, and vulnerabilities, or some emotions behind fears that explain why people decide not to share their data. But also the second theme is about cultural reluctance, which is more about practices, structures, and policies. So there you have this idea, for example, of that sharing is not a priority, this idea of time, the idea of the lack of recognition, and also that leaders, they often don't engage in these practices. So with those two key themes, we have trying to use some social science concepts that come from, for example, this social science of science, trying to understand those fears, those uncertainties, and those forms of resistance. So we have, for example, trying to understand those barriers through the concept of resistance, through the concept of a sacrifice, because it's a very kind of existential experience when you don't want to, or you have to change a practice that is embedded in your professional identity. And also this idea of negotiation of identity. So just to summarize, we have found two key themes, and we have tried to explain those barriers using some social science concept. We're going to explain a bit more in detail those relationship between the barriers and the concept in the later, but now it's just to have a general understanding of those barriers. But as Alison said, we know that those barriers are not something new. They even, I think you know, because you work with data, you work with people trying to share data, you know that those barriers really exist and you have to deal with them at everyday level. So also, I want just to highlight some of the literature that is that highlight those barriers as well. So for example, the idea of time, the idea that sharing is not a common practice, the idea that sharing is extra work, and there, for example, there's a lack of training and so on and so on. So there's multiple problems and barriers that are around data sharing that we have found, but also you can see in the literature. So this is another example about how we can understand the social and cultural barriers to data sharing. So just to summarize, so we have, if you see this diagram, you can see on the top that there are some observed barriers. So the fear of judgment, the fear of losing control, and so on. But then you have some kind of social science concept that trying to explain, trying to inform, trying to rethink the way we understand those barriers. So, because what we are trying to say is that we identify barriers, but we have to understand the different relationship, the barriers, and how those barriers relate also with, for example, policies, new technologies, objects, and so on. So that is the social and cultural aspect of data sharing, is like that relationship between all these elements together. So, or also in the core, you can see that what we are trying to do is to understand, to reframe these discussions in order to provide people working with data the tools to navigate these different tensions. So that is the main goal. So now I'm going to hand over to Eileen for this part.
Yes, so our project has been about trying to find ways of identifying those barriers and thinking about really what's underneath them in maybe a more complex way, but it's also about then once we have kind of explored those barriers, thinking about what we can do to address them, because like Francisco is saying, you know, people have known that these things exist for a while, but you know, what have we done about them? So that this is something that we're trying out, is to find a way of co-designing responses to them through professional development activities that are not simply like training in skills, but other kinds of activities that enable people to get a bit deeper with those barriers and maybe find ways to negotiate them, to sort of move beyond them potentially, or, you know, change things so that the barriers no longer exist in the same way. So what we are thinking about here is you know, exploring that resistance and thinking of it not necessarily as being just a bad thing, but something that we can build and that you know is constantly moving, and you know, we could be part of helping it move along a way that actually creates a more more open community for data sharing. So, but to do that, we've got to rethink a little bit about what we mean by professional development activities, because a lot of the things that are often kind of used by communities when you want to change practice are things like training courses. Here's a quick course on a skill. You know, activities to help people do what they are supposed to be doing. But the challenge there is, of course, you've got to get the people or to engage with those activities. And if they're resisting, if they don't want to do it, then they're not going to be doing that training. So in a sense, what we're thinking about is a different approach to professional development. Francisco, can you do the next slide? And so you think about that on the top row here, we've got different types of professional development activities, from training, well, for you know, the kind of training that you need to to adopt a policy, like this is a new policy, tell everybody about it, to training to do the kinds of things that the policy requires, and to, you know, develop skills and knowledge related to that. But the kinds of barriers that we've been identifying are these things that are to do with people's professional identity, to do with epistemologies, how you see the world in terms of what our scientific practices. And they're not the kind of things that you lend themselves to training courses to resolve. They need much more like social and collaborative learning experiences, because that's how professionals in any field learn. They tell each other stories, they work things out. And then, of course, what we're really interested in is how that applies to the actual workplace, so that this is not a simple thing. It needs the support of other learners to help you do it. And so we could kind of think that there are some activities that regularly take place within, you know, DRI communities, like data challenges, hackathons, sandpits, those kinds of things, you know, have some of that, like social collaborative learning. But then there's also things that you might, you know, people often talk about wanting to put in place a community of practice. Those kinds of things would be in line with this. But of course, you do need to design activities to support that. It doesn't just happen. And then other things like, you know, thinking about changes to or like sort of campaigns or ways of doing things that provide professional development opportunities in a different way, like that hidden REF that maybe addresses, you know, barriers like that. So we're really thinking about things that are going along the bottom of this picture. Francisco? So, without going too deep into the like pedagogies that we've been using, you know, what we've been trying to do is to get people together then to see if we can try out an approach to co-design which emphasizes that social and collaborative learning, maybe not so much on the what people often focus on, which is the sort of acquisition, people telling you something, but like thinking about what people do with that knowledge. And we held a workshop where we had teams of people working on co-designing using this sort of kind of storyboard and cards that indicates different learning types, like discussion, for instance, like practice, like collaboration. And we put together some learning designs, and I've transferred them from paper to a digital format so that they're available for anybody else to use. And they kind of try to think of ways to address some of these barriers. So, for instance, people try to tackle leadership in data sharing by creating activity to support a community of practice, to support leadership in data sharing. Another group looked at the lack of recognition for data sharing by creating an activity to explore how getting to know the narrative CV that we're required these days to use could involve a data sharing. And similarly, like, you know, an approach to handle or to try to address fear of judgments through peer support and so on. And so those learning designs are now digitally available for anyone to adapt and use. We're using a tool that we developed in UCL Knowledge Lab for that purpose, not this specific purpose, but generally for sharing learning designs. And so that's one thing that we've done, and it seemed to work. And we've met with some of the representatives of the communities, and you know, to see whether or not people, you know, can build on that approach. And certainly they've been building on it in terms of the methodologies they've been using for designing things. And we've got some really good ideas, and we're hoping to pilot one of these designs so that we can evaluate it and see whether or not, you know, it supports what we want it to do. Francisco? And so what I've just been saying about the shareable learning designs, this is the design in the Learning Designer for the sort of addressing the lack of recognition, the research and development workshop activity, looking at the narrative CV. So it's there, it's, you know, it's still, you know, we're going to refine it more, you know, develop it more, run it with a community, and then evaluate it in terms of whether or not that learning happens, but also whether or not people feel that they can apply it to their context, and like see it all the way through. So, and that approach also gives us an idea of how we think about evaluating these things, because it's not just about what you get from the workshop, but really, does it make a difference to your working environment? Can you apply it? Can you create value for other people from doing so? And so that's the sort of the blue bit of the circle, the pilot, I suppose, that we've been working on here. What we're going to talk about a bit now is kind of moving from working in that kind of pilot mode to how we're proposing to engage the wider community in using these social science approaches, and embed this way of thinking within how we're approaching some of the challenges that relate to data sharing and potentially other things that come along on the horizon. And I'll hand over, I think, to Francisco now, is it?
It's to me, yes.
It's to you, sorry, Alison, to take.
No problem. So one of the things that we've tried to emphasize here is that open science brings new epistemology and new norms. And so that means that we have new ways, people have new ways of thinking and new ways of doing things. And what we want to emphasize here is the human aspect of the changes as we adopt new digital research infrastructure, as data becomes more open, and so on. And if we go to next slide, in the digital research landscape has been focused on areas like new compute and data, the sustainability issues in terms of reaching net zero by 2050, interoperable federated resources, and so on. And a lot of these are really important issues for people to engage with, but the way that we engage with them tends to be very technically focused. It's focused on the compute, on the infrastructure, on the data, and so on. And of course, it's really important for people to learn about new knowledge and learn new skills through training. And also, you mentioned before about experiential learning. All of that is really, really important. But I guess what we're trying to emphasize is, next slide, there's also a very human element here. It's so we want to focus very much on the humans and the social approach alongside the technical approach. So people have to learn how to work in a more interdisciplinary way. So we're working with different disciplines. We're also working with people in different professions. So people who are focused on research in a particular discipline are working with data stewards and people that run the digital research infrastructure, for example, and working across sectors as well. It's not that that hasn't happened before, but it really has been scaled up. And all of this affects every individual's professional identity, the kinds of skills and knowledge sets they need to have, but also the way that they work. And that can instill in people excitement or fear or lots of different emotions, and we need to take those into consideration. So in the next slide, if we go back to the iceberg diagram that we showed you before, you can see at the top there are these challenges that we identified, things like fear of judgment or fear of losing control over data. But what we're trying to do is analyze those using social science concepts to think about what does it mean when people fear they're losing control over their own data. So, for example, is there some kind of epistemic anxiety? So do I, as a physicist or a bioscientist, for example, worry about not being able to use the infrastructure as I did before because I have to rely on other people? So there are all these issues, and these are the kinds of things that we're trying to find ways of addressing head on. So I'm going to hand back to Francisco, who's going to talk about these challenges.
Yes, thank you, Alison. Yes, based on those challenges, what we want to do now very quickly as well is trying to show how social science can respond to those challenges in a way that to inform or to reframe the discussions within science communities, like from the scientists to also people working with data. So we have the first challenge, which is, for example, this idea of how to foster a digital research culture to enable the adoption of FAIR principles. So that challenge is driven by the idea that we need a workforce that engage in FAIR practices, but also there is some social and cultural barriers, like as we said, like time, lack of recognition, and so on and so on. But also we have some solutions that fail. That, for example, this idea of the win-win. We have these assumptions that solutions, or if we implement a solution which is about that win-win, everyone will be happy. However, what we want to say here is like, look, we need to understand this challenge from the perspective that there is a sort of sacrifice that people have to do when adopting new practices. But that sacrifice needs also an exchange process. You need to not just to give up something, but also you need to receive something in return that is more valuable. So what we're trying to say here is like, we need to move from this idea of win-win approach to say, okay, we need to negotiate something. And one of the things we can negotiate is as Alison said, this idea of professional identity, the thing or the set of values, the practices, and the social norms that guide our practices. So there is some idea here about we need to give up something, but also to receive something else in return. Maybe that could be a negotiation of identity. So yeah, this slide is just more or less to say that, okay, what we need to use or to address this challenge is more transparency in the acknowledgement that there are some trade-offs that we need to negotiate, and those trade-offs have an individual level, community, and policy level to engage in data and fair data practices. I don't know if maybe I'm gonna continue because of the time. I'm gonna have the questions at the end of, maybe, I don't know if does anyone have a question so far?
We have a question in chat, Francisco. So this is Eva. Question for later based on your research project. Yeah. So do you think the fears and worries and barriers are common across disciplines, or have you seen that some are more common in certain disciplines than others?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think it's because this was a pilot, what we did is just to understand the fears across disciplines. However, we know when we discuss, for example, the fear of losing control over data in a given discipline, you can find some differences. So for example, because we did also a pilot with the astronomers, I can say that fear is quite specific given the changes they are facing in practices. So for example, the astronomers now in the near future will no longer have access to raw data, for example. So that experience, that fear is different from the fears of other disciplines. So it's, yes, but at least in this pilot, we didn't have the opportunity to go deeper in a given community. So yes, I don't know if
Can-
Alison, yeah.
Can I respond to that as well? I think this is a great question because I think, yeah, because this is a pilot, we can't really definitively answer this question, but I think the question should extend not only to disciplines, but also to job roles as well. So people with some job roles, for example, a data steward probably has different fears from someone who is an early career researcher, for example, but it depends very much on the context. Shall we move forward?
Yes. Yes, this is a second example of how we can, such as science, respond to challenges. So the second challenge is how disciplines can engage in data sharing and the need to interdisciplinary research. So, for example, the fears, or sorry, the barriers here is like the fears of losing control over data, the lack of common vocabulary or language, and so on. So, but what we're trying to say here is like could be useful to see these fears through the lens of resistance. So, as Eileen said before, resistance is often seen as a negative practice, as something that, okay, people resist to stop change. What we're trying to say here is like there is a productive aspect of resistance. So what we are proposing is to explore resistance practices and to understand why people resist on the one hand, but also how people resist the practices. So by exploring how people resist, we can find alternative ways of doing science. So what we're trying to say again is like to say, okay, resistance maybe is not a bad thing. Maybe it could be something that we can learn. We can have something to learn from. So that is the second example. And also we have this concept of trading zones or trading spaces is where people can build in between languages, in between vocabularies to negotiate different identities. So I'm going to just move to this final point. I mean, about the challenges. So the challenge number 3 is, for example, when a new digital research infrastructure is proposed, you have to co-design the infrastructure with the community needs, based on the community needs. But there is some tendency that to privilege technical decisions over others' decisions. So what we're saying here is like, maybe we need to consider some concepts like the concept of epistemic diversity and epistemic injustice when designing or co-designing these infrastructures at different levels. Why? Because what we mean by epistemic diversity is to say that to recognize, to acknowledge that every decision we make is a way to exclude a vision, to exclude a practice, and so on. So we have to acknowledge that that process, the process of exclusions. And the same is about epistemic injustices, is you can exclude different voices, and maybe those voices you exclude, or the practices you exclude, come from a very particular community. So that is the last example. So now I'm gonna, I think, to Eileen, right?
I'm wondering, Francis, because of the time, maybe we could just sort of stop it at this point. If we just explain what our next step is. So we showed you a picture of you know, the sort of 2 circles, the sort of pilot in the middle. Here we are. And you know, then taking that out into the wider community. what we're thinking about now is beyond the project ends in March next year, but after that, what we want to propose is an applied learning program for DRI professionals that, you know, tries to create this kind of culture of data sharing, like that uses, that embeds these kinds of concepts and methodologies that we've been talking about. So really what the applied learning program will focus on is using a kind of problem framing and co-design approach, and focusing on thinking about more in depth the sort of epistemic cultures of science and data sharing, the way in which in terms of the challenges Francisco's been talking about, the resistance, sacrifice and identity need to be sort of negotiated within them. And will sort of help people to explore the epistemic diversity and epistemic injustices potentially that arise from data sharing, as well as using the tools and methods for co-designing that we talked about earlier, like collaborative ethnography, like using a co-design and learning design approach, and evaluating for thinking about the end values that people can take away for their work practice. I mean, one of the things that one of our interviewees talked about, for instance, is to sort of try to get people to develop more of a nuanced approach to data criticality. Sort of, you know, he said people often talk about data literacy, but data criticality, you know, really thinking about all of these issues. Maybe we could work on something like that. So things like that, to sort of, you know, take a little bit more of a nuanced approach to what is involved underneath the surface of data of data sharing. You know, because it seems like it's very simple. You just train people, they do it, but that misses that sort of you know, what's underneath the waterline in our sort of diagram of the iceberg. So if we maybe just finish there, you know, so we've got a bit of an opportunity and not much time to kind of get some of your responses to what we've presented to you.